Russian President Vladimir Putin's army is crumbling as Ukraine's powerful resistance saps its will to fight. When he rolled into Ukraine in February 2022, he thought his supposed special military operation would be over in less than a week. It's been more than 3 years, and now Russia's leader is dealing with a demoralized army that has no equipment, no structure, and has been completely drained of its will to keep going after a series of attritional campaigns. The reality Putin now has to face is that it's his own tactics that experts believe are going to lead to Russia losing in Ukraine. On April 8, Times Radio conducted an in-depth interview about the state of Russia's military with George Barros, the team lead of the Institute for the Study of Wars, or ISW's Russia and Geospatial Intelligence teams. Barros has spent the last 3 years of his career studying Putin and his military's attempts to take Ukraine. His conclusion: Russia can't continue Putin's intense offensive operations at the same intensity it's maintained during the invasion.
I think the Russians are going to have some very difficult scenarios. These problems are going to continue maturing. Assuming that, of course, the casualty rate presumes the same, assuming the tempo of operations resumes.
What problems are those? Let's start with a major escalation. Ukraine recently announced that it had captured a pair of Chinese soldiers fighting alongside the Russian army in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. Ukraine's foreign minister said that the capture puts into question China's declared stance for peace in the war, with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also saying that he believes far more than 2 Chinese soldiers are operating on the Russian side. Even the capture of the 2 in Ukraine made clear that the country is fighting against a unit that had at least 6 Chinese soldiers. Barros says that this incident could end up being a turning point in the Ukraine war. It would be a major inflection if it is indeed true. We have Chinese personnel operating within Russian military units and formations. It would be a big deal. And it would be a big deal in more ways than one when it comes to Russia's operational abilities. Barros notes that there's a school of thought inside the US right now that Europe should deal with European problems such as the Ukraine war. The US, on the other hand, should focus on more immediate threat that China represents. The problem with this approach, as Barros explains, is that the two can no longer be separated.
This indicates that, look, we're not living in a world in which these are 2 separate theaters. Europe is a theater, and China's a theater, and it's either or. Actually, this support indicates the theaters are linked. You can't stovepipe it all, and in order to think about how do you deter and if necessary defeat actors in one part of the world, you can't take the luxury of morsalizing it and deciding either or. It's a both and.
In other words, the capture of Chinese soldiers in Ukraine may mean that the US gets more heavily involved in fighting against Russia in the future. It's a wake-up call. The US has just learned that it can't focus on China alone when the nation is closely enough aligned with Russia to be allowing mercenaries to sign up for Putin's army. Does that mean the US will put boots on the ground in Ukraine? No. But operationally, it offers the first sign that Putin's army is crumbling for 2 reasons. First, Putin is clearly relying on foreign support to keep his attacks going. Barros notes that this Chinese involvement adds to the confirmed Iranian provisions of weapons to Russia, along with North Korea's decision to send over 10,000 soldiers to Russia back in late 2024. All are signs that Putin is getting desperate for manpower. He's trying to counter that issue. On April 2nd, Putin conscripted another 160,000 Russians to his military in the largest conscription of its kind since he started the Ukraine invasion. Those novices will undergo a couple of months of training before being thrust onto the front lines of a war that's already claimed over 927,000 of Russia's soldiers. The odds are that most of them won't last long, and their deaths, injuries or captures will only add to a growing manpower crisis Russia's leader faces, that he may increasingly try to solve by hiring more foreign mercenaries. Which leads to the second reason that the capture of the 2 Chinese soldiers shows that Russia's army is crumbling. As Putin relies more heavily on foreign soldiers, he'll keep pushing the US to get involved. If the US decides to take drastic action, such as implementing tariffs or sanctions against China for supplying mercenary troops, Putin may find that his foreign sources of soldiers start drying up as he struggles with Russian manpower. It would be a 1-2 punch, with Putin's army growing weaker as he pulls from the ever-depleting stock of soldiers at home, all while he loses the experience of mercenaries he's currently getting from other countries. But it gets worse for Vladimir. If the use of Chinese mercenaries demonstrates that Putin's military is crumbling on the manpower front, another incident shows that he's also struggling to protect Russia's borders. Ukraine is currently conducting operations in Belgorod. In fact, it's not just conducting operations in the Russian oblast. According to The Times, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has confirmed that Ukraine has captured more Russian territory. Zelensky said during an address on April 7, "We continue to conduct active operations in border areas on enemy territory, and this is absolutely right. The war must return where it came from." The Times followed up those statements by confirming that Ukraine now holds about 5 square miles of Russian territory near the village of Demidovka, thanks to an operation that began at some point in March. The invasion echoes the counter-invasion Ukraine launched into Kursk in August 2024, and according to Barros, it's not particularly surprising. Speaking about the territory Ukraine has captured, Barros says,
"As of April 7th, we assessed that the Ukrainians held an estimated 12 square kilometers or so of territory in Belgorod, so not a particularly large amount, but it appears to have been a supporting effort designed to help alleviate pressure from the Ukrainians as they were making their fighting withdrawal from Kursk."
That withdrawal has been a massive drain on Putin's resources. Canal 13 says that Russia's losses in the oblast have exceeded 54,900 personnel since Putin launched his counter-offensive to retake the territory Ukraine claimed in August. Bear in mind that Putin amassed around 50,000 soldiers, including the 10,000 North Koreans mentioned earlier, for that operation. The scale of those losses is a microcosm of the crumbling of Putin's military. Russia's leader was forced to dip into his reserves to retake Kursk, and those reserves are in the oblast to support his later efforts in Sumy, as well as to potentially support Belgorod. With those soldiers getting chewed up in Kursk, Putin wasn't able to do a thing to stop Ukraine's incursion into Belgorod. The result? Putin may have retaken Kursk, but he's on the verge of facing the same situation all over again, especially if Ukraine continues its advance deeper into Belgorod to take more territory there. That'll mean thousands more soldiers being diverted away from the areas of Ukraine where Putin wants to apply pressure. And those are soldiers Putin can't spare, given the scale of the manpower issue he's facing. Worse yet for Putin, the only reason he was successful in Kursk in the first place was circumstance. The Russians exploited the American intelligence sharing cutoff to really accelerate what was then ongoing Russian pushes to expel Ukrainian forces from Kursk. Barros explains to Times Radio. He's referring to the brief period in early March when US President Donald Trump banned the sharing of any US intelligence with Ukraine. That ban has since been lifted, and therein lies a problem for Putin's military. Putin can't rely on a similar ban helping him with the Ukrainian forces invading Belgorod. That means he might end up losing tens of thousands more troops to retake the territory. Not ideal for an army that's already crumbling. And given that the initial troops Putin will send to the region will likely be those that have managed to survive the fighting in Kursk, you have to wonder how much will to fight those soldiers have left. They're already exhausted. They also can't rely on any of the 160,000 conscripts Putin is pushing into his army because they won't be ready until the summer. So they'll have to fight again. And that while demoralized and potentially easy targets for Ukraine's forces in Belgorod. There's also the diversion factor to consider, Barros explains to Times Radio.
This could also be an effort to try to spoil anticipated Russian offensives into northern Ukraine. Zelensky's been warning about a major Russian push in northern Ukraine. Of course, the Russians are operating in Sumy Oblast for the first time since 2022.
A lot of the Russian combat power that fought in Kursk was supposed to head into Sumy, says Barros. Now, what's happening in Belgorod could in theory help divert some of those forces that would be going into Sumy to keep them on Russian territory instead, according to Barros. Just like that, Putin's plans lie in tatters. By the time he expels Ukraine from Belgorod, assuming he even manages it with an already depleted northern force, he may have nothing left to continue his assaults in Sumy. And there are yet more signs that Putin's military is crumbling, even with the addition of his 160,000 new conscripts. Even though their training won't be completed until the summer, according to Barros, that may not even matter.
These 160,000 guys that recently were conscripted, they're not going to fight in Ukraine. Legally, conscripts cannot fight in Ukraine. The order that Putin signed specifies that they will not fight in Ukraine, and they're sort of viewed as basically helpless kids that have no say in anything.
Now, Putin might break, or at least bend his own laws to send the conscripts to the front lines. After all, he's done it before. As Radio Free Liberty reports, Putin often tricks his young conscripts, who are typically in their late teens, into signing professional military contracts that far extend their legally mandated year of service. Those conscripts often find themselves among the dead in Ukraine, showcasing once again just how desperate Putin is to plug his manpower gaps. However, not all of the 160,000 will sign, meaning Putin can't rely on his fresh wave of soldiers to help him in Ukraine. What does that mean for his forces on the front lines? It's demoralizing. Any hopes many of them had for their tours of duty ending are dashed as they're forced to stay in Ukraine for as long as possible. They grow weaker by the day as Ukraine inflicts more casualties. And even if the full 160,000 end up in Ukraine, the fact that they're just kids means they're not going to be as much use outside of serving as cannon fodder for Putin's meat grinder. Putin's only recourse is to offer more money to get those conscripts to sign up once they complete their year of service and become reserves. What's going to happen to these conscripts in about a year's time is the recruiters are going to come and say, "Hey, we're going to promise you all of these benefits and all this money. Why don't you sign a contract to go fight in Ukraine?" Barros says. That leads to another sign that Putin's army is collapsing. He can barely afford to keep paying his soldiers as much as he is. Estimates vary on how much Russia is paying its soldiers, though the world says that many are being paid in the region of $2,000 to $3,000 per month. Russia also offers compensation to the families of those killed in Ukraine, which IntelliNews says can reach up to $115,000. Add bonuses for signing up that can be as high as $30,000, and you get a very expensive way to bring recruits into the Russian military. All of this money is being spent at a time when Russia's wealth fund has fallen to $30 billion from the $100 billion it stood at before Putin launched his invasion. Russia is also struggling under the weight of sanctions and has switched to a wartime economy, all of which combine to mean only one thing. Sooner or later, the money's going to dry up. Russia's economy is lumbering toward a slow death, according to the Telegraph. And when that happens, Putin is going to lose the financial carrot he puts on the end of the stick he uses to convince so many people to fight for his cause. The pressure Barros says Putin places on so many of his conscripts to sign up will become a lot less effective if he runs out of cash to serve as a temptation. Barros makes this same point to Times Radio. He notes that right now, Russia isn't quite feeling the effects of its looming manpower problems. Putin is still convincing between 30,000 and 45,000 volunteers to sign up for his army to fight in Ukraine, says Barros, many of whom will be previous conscripts signed up in cycles that took place before Putin's latest round.
That's not a problem now, but the rate at which they're finding them is decreasing. The amount of financial compensation that the Russian government has to give each individual volunteer is increasing. And this is, of course, destroying the Russian economy in real time.
He's not wrong. Back in February, the Moscow Times reported that military recruitment in Moscow alone had fallen fivefold since a mid-2024 peak. Back then, Russia was hiring up to 250 soldiers per day. That's now dropped to just 40 per day, even with Putin's conscription efforts. Again, these are signs of Russia's will to fight draining. People simply don't want to sign up for Putin's military, even as he increases the monetary rewards available for doing so. That situation has forced Putin to take some drastic actions, the outlet says. It claims foreign nationals from countries like China, as mentioned earlier, South Africa and Ghana are signing up in significant numbers. Some officials in Russia even claim to have seen a pattern where groups of around 10 foreign nationals all arrive at recruitment centres at the same time. There's also the measure Putin introduced in October 2024 that allows criminal defendants to avoid being prosecuted if they instead sign up for the military. Russia expects that measure to deliver 25,000 troops to Putin's cause. None of this is sustainable. Russia only has so many criminals it can call upon before it's forced back into relying on its ever-dwindling stockpiles of volunteers. The same goes for the foreign nationals arriving in Russia. They're lured in by the same sort of bumper pay packets Russia is using to attract the few volunteers it's getting. However, as Putin sends his country hurtling deeper into the economic abyss, those pay packages will dry up, along with the foreign mercenaries who are taking them. It all adds up to a dire situation for Putin's army, as Barros explains.
I think the Russians are going to have some very difficult scenarios, not in the immediate window, not in the 6-month window, but perhaps in the 12 to 14, 12 to 16 month window. That's when these problems are going to continue maturing. Assuming that, of course, the casualty rate resumes the same, assuming the tempo of operations resumes and maintains the same.
Barros admits he's making some assumptions here, specifically about Russia's casualty rate. Still, that doesn't seem like it's going to markedly decline anytime soon. On March 30, Russia lost 1,230 soldiers in a single day. That rate doesn't seem to be dropping as we head into April, as April 5 saw it lose 1,330 soldiers in one day. Those sorts of numbers have become the standard for Putin's military. He's regularly seeing monthly casualty rates that either come close to, or in some cases, exceed 40,000 soldiers. Given the manpower, recruitment and monetary issues Putin has created with his Ukraine invasion, those numbers aren't sustainable, Barros points out. And it's already having an effect, even before the 12-month window Barros describes.
I'd note for you that the Russian rate of advance in Ukraine has been decreasing precipitously since December 2024, which seems to be a positive sign. So the Russians are taking on roughly the same amount of casualties, but for a lot fewer gains. So these stresses do seem to be catching up, and I would argue that Russia's resources are finite.
Therein lies the crux of the problem for Putin's army. When Putin failed to achieve his goal of taking over Ukraine in less than a week, he switched to an attritional strategy. That seemed to make sense. Russia had massive manpower and equipment volume advantages. What Putin didn't count on was the sheer amount of military aid Ukraine would receive from its Western partners, which has amounted to over $272.33 billion and counting, according to the Kiel Institute. Ukraine has several guarantees of ongoing support from many of its European partners, all of which add up to more equipment entering the country. A war of attrition only works when you're wearing your opponent down through superior numbers. Now, Russia's army is the victim of Putin's attrition. And that's only going to create more problems for Putin in the future, says Barros. They do have to take breaks. There will be opportunities for Ukraine to exploit Russia's vulnerabilities, he says. The West's job from here on out is to help Ukraine to identify these opportunities. Ukraine is already doing that as much as it can. For instance, in Pokrovsk, where Putin has focused most of his efforts in recent weeks, Russian advances are slowing to a crawl. Ukraine is also conducting clever counterattacks in those sorts of regions, says Barros, demonstrating how it's already taking advantage of Putin's army crumbling. More of those opportunities will come over the next 12 months, and certainly afterward if Barros's estimations are correct. What you're looking at here is almost a year and a half of sustained campaigning in one single direction to only advance 60 kilometers. Barros says about the Pokrovsk campaign. That's a lot, and that takes a toll, he concludes. Barros believes Pokrovsk will survive the summer, and that survival will only mean that Putin has seen his army crumble before him. The cracks are already there. He's running out of people, money, and the collective will of his people. If Ukraine can hold out for another 12 months as Russia further diminishes itself, we may just see the attritional war Putin started ultimately play out in Ukraine's favor. But what do you think about Barros's comments and the state of Russia's military right now? Is there anything Putin can do to solve the litany of problems he faces as the Ukraine invasion moves deeper into 2025? How can Ukraine exploit the new gaps forming in Russia's military? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. We're an independent source of news and information about military conflicts around the globe and greatly appreciate your support.